can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment of the High Elevation 5-Needle White Pine Science and Management webinar series. This series is brought to you by Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, whose mission is to support the conservation of whitebark pine ecosystems by promoting restoration, education, management, and research projects that enhance knowledge and stewardship of these valuable ecosystems. The foundation is a member-based organization composed of individuals and organizations who share a passion for education and restoration of a unique high mountain ecosystem. If you're interested in joining the foundation, please visit whitebarkfound.org/membership. The link for that will be in the chat today. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Chris Ray. Dr. Chris Ray studies and models the dynamics of plant and animal populations, focusing especially on threatened species with fragmented populations. Recent projects include modeling bird population trends in the national parks of the Pacific Northwest, analyzing the role of meta-community dynamics in plant community assembly, and modeling the spatial and temporal dynamics of disease in mammal communities. Her long-term project involves research on the American pika, aimed at understanding climatic influences on the distribution of that species. So if you have any questions following Chris's talk, we would encourage you to virtually raise your hand so that we can enable you to unmute yourself and start a dialogue that goes for comments as well. And if you're unable to do so, you can put your questions or comments in the chat and I'll read them. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. I don't consider myself any sort of well-rounded expert on white pines or nutcrackers, and I think you see that I work on other things, but I have put some effort into one study of this system, and I'll describe that for you today. In the chat, I pasted the citation to my only paper on this subject, along with links to that paper and supplementary material related to that paper. So those links are in the chat, and the paper is open access, so it should be available to everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and see if I can start focusing on this. Comes. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that presentation now. This work was done in collaboration with partners in the National Park Service and my colleagues at the Institute for Bird Populations. The National Park Service partners were Regina Rochefort, Jason Ransom, Jonathan Nesmith, Sylvia Haltain, and John Betch. Gina and Johnny have moved on from the Park Service, but they still have a hand in this project. And I'll talk more about their roles as I go along. We also worked with Clark's Nutcracker expert Taza Shaming for the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative. And finally, at the Institute for Bird Populations, I had the support of Mandy Holmgren and Bob Wilkerson, who led the collection of our bird data, and Rodney Siegel, our executive director. So the mutualism between whitebark pine and Clark's Nutcracker is famous for structuring high elevation ecosystems throughout Western North America. And this beautiful illustration by Misaki Wichita depicts the many roles of whitebark pine in high elevation ecosystem. And it really emphasizes the importance of Clark's Nutcracker in facilitating the impact of these trees. So notice the different species foraging on whitebark, and especially the interaction of snow and whitebark on the slopes in the background. These interactions are important throughout Western North America, but I'll focus on forests of the Sierra Cascades region from the northern Washington state to Southern California. As a keystone species, the presence of whitebark increases biodiversity, structures ecosystems, and alters hydrologic cycling, hence the need for organizations like we're talking for today. So this tree literally provides water, forage, and habitat for many other species, and Clark's nutcracker controls the distribution of these processes by dispersing whitebark seeds and helping them germinate. Nutcrackers store more seeds than they eat, and they cache them in microhabitats that help the seeds grow. So whitebark feeds this mutualism by offering up a very nutritious seed, and most whitebark germinate from neglected food stores of nutcrackers. But of course, now there are new threats to this mutualism. Whitebark is being killed by an exotic rust fungus and by native pests and wildfire as climate changes. This image shows the lethal effects of white pine blister rust as it girdles a whitebark pine. Our study focuses on effects of blister rust in Washington state, where rust is now common, and in California, where it's not so prevalent. And these problems interact, of course, with other threats that the whitebark pine faces, such as fire and climate change. As whitebark are killed by blister rust and other threats, will nutcrackers also begin to disappear from these landscapes? That's the big question. So if so, there'd be fewer nutcrackers to disperse whitebark seeds, leading to a vicious cycle of increasing whitebark losses. But Clark's nutcracker feeds opportunistically on many resources. In this image, a nutcracker forages in the crown of a fire-killed ponderosa pine. So our main question in this research is whether nutcrackers actually respond numerically to trends in whitebark as a resource. Regina Rochford, one of our main collaborators, led whitebark monitoring at long-term plots when she was at the National Park Service. And these are some of the things that she sees other than blister rust cankers, like cone production and what's termed crown kill, or say across a plot, the mean percent of each tree's crown that is dead for whatever reason. These kinds of data were taken both in the North Cascades and in the Sierra Nevada network that we'll be talking about. We also, of course, I mentioned worked with Taja Chamey because she's the expert on what the nutcracker needs at each stage of its life cycle. So we studied this question in 4 national parks. In Washington state, whitebark and nutcrackers have been monitored in the North Cascades and Mount Rainier since 2005. And in California, Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon have been monitored since 2011. So a longer time series in the north, shorter time series in the south. Our tree and bird data come from separate monitoring projects with sampling plots that don't typically overlap. So bird counts are conducted at points along transects, which look like squiggly lines on this map of Sequoia Kings Canyon. And the tree data are collected from plots shown as triangles. So one goal of our project was to develop a modeling framework that can integrate data from different monitoring projects across these 2 trophic levels, from seeds to seed predators. So we also explored separate spatial and temporal models. So for the longer data sets from our northern parks, where whitebark are clearly in decline, we aggregated data at the park scale and modeled annual variation in both trees and birds. Now, for the shorter data sets from our southern parks, where whitebark are not yet in decline, we aggregated data over time and modeled the spatial distribution of nutcrackers as a function of the spatial distribution of tree resources. So coming at the question from a couple of different angles: temporal in the north, spatial in the south. An interesting feature of our southernmost park is that whitebark gives way there to another 5-needle white pine. As we move from north to south within Sequoia Kings Canyon, foxtail pine becomes more abundant than whitebark. Foxtail pine has a much smaller seed with its own wing for dispersal. And although it's harvested by Clark's nutcracker, it isn't dependent on the nutcracker for dispersal. So we modeled nutcracker density at each point in this park as a response to the local abundance of whitebark and foxtail. Tree cover within 125 meters of each bird point count station was our metric of local tree abundance. And we allowed for interaction between effects of whitebark and foxtail on nutcracker density. We used a Bayesian hierarchical approach for this analysis to allow for imperfect detection of birds and effects of covariates like background noise, the date, and the observer on the distance and time to detection of the nutcrackers. These models also allowed for any uncertainty in the tree data to enhance uncertainty in our estimates of bird density, because those depended on tree metrics. Our main question was whether nutcrackers respond to trends in the Whitebark and other trends. So I'll focus here on the submodels of nutcracker density that we considered. In the temporal models that we applied to data from the two northern parks, our null model was that nutcracker density just varied by year. We also considered several other models in which nutcracker density responded to annual variation in Whitebark metrics like the number of live trees, rust-infected trees, or total crown kill of Whitebark at the park level. Crown kill was defined as the mean percent of mortality of Whitebark crowns. Our expectation was that nutcrackers would be more abundant where more trees were alive and healthy and had seed-producing crowns. So linking models of Whitebark and nutcrackers in a Bayesian framework allowed us to account for uncertainty in our Whitebark metrics, like crown kill, and let that uncertainty just percolate through the model to affect our uncertainty in bird response to the Whitebark. Our approach also allowed for appropriate scaling of the spatial process. We were able to derive annual estimates of each Whitebark metric at the scale of the park. So we could model birds at each point count station as a response to seed resources across the park, which seemed most appropriate for birds with such high vigility. They can really move fast. So in the spatial models that we applied to data from the two southern parks, our null model was that nutcracker density simply increased with increasing elevation. The alternative model for birds in Yosemite allowed nutcracker density to respond to Whitebark cover. And the alternative model for birds in Sequoia Kings Canyon allowed nutcracker density to respond to Whitebark cover, foxtail cover, and their interaction. I'm going to go back here and say, as an aside, we did not officially rank the null and alternative models. It's still awkward and even controversial to apply model selection to the hierarchical mixture models that we used. So I think this is an exploratory analysis. We were just trying to determine whether Whitebark seed resource proxies, like crown kill or something, could explain variation in nutcracker density, and more generally, whether we could develop a modeling approach suitable for integrating these potentially complementary data sets from long-term monitoring in a multi-trophic system. In a few years, when there's a bit more data and a bit less controversy about how to rank these models, we hope to revisit this exercise and provide a more formal ranking of alternatives. And the results of our exploratory analysis were quite suggestive that it will be important to track the system through time, because there's a real possibility that the proposed feedbacks are important. So before I go on to the model results, I'd like to explain why we did not consider interacting effects of mountain pine beetle in these models. In the North Coast and Cascades network, blister rust infected a substantial percentage of Whitebark, increasing from about 18 to 38% in Mount Rainier and from 32 to 51% in the North Cascades. Sometimes less than 1% of those trees were infected by beetles. Never more than 6.7% of the Whitebark were infested by beetles. Similarly, mountain pine beetle infected less than 1% of all Whitebark and foxtail pines surveyed in the Sierra Nevada network. So we did not attempt to model its effects anywhere. Another important point is that blister rust infected less than 1% of Whitebark and none of the foxtail pines surveyed in the Sierra Nevada network, these southern plots that you're looking at now. So in the Sierra Nevada, we focused on nutcracker response to white pine resources without reference to any pests or pathogens. And in the North Coast and Cascades network, we focused on nutcracker response to blister rust without reference to mountain pine beetle. So starting with spatial results from Yosemite, this plot shows that nutcracker density was higher where Whitebark cover was more abundant. Whitebark cover and elevation were highly correlated in this park. because the whitebark occur at higher elevations. So 2 models were supported by the data, effects of elevation or effects of whitebark cover on nutcracker density. In Sequoia Kings Canyon, whitebark and foxtail cover were less correlated with elevation. And we found support for additive effects of all 3 variables on nutcracker density. There was no support for an interaction effect between whitebark and foxtail. But nutcracker density was at least somewhat predicted by whitebark cover in our spatial models. And foxtail cover and especially elevation explained additional variance in the nutcracker density. In fact, we standardized the cover of whitebark and foxtail as covariates in this model. I'm going to go back here. And so we can compare the magnitude of their estimated effects. And we found that the effects of whitebark and foxtail cover on nutcracker response was similar in that the 95% credible interval on their effects actually overlapped considerably. The results of our temporal models of nutcracker density in the northern parks varied between them. So in the North Cascades, nutcracker density varied dramatically and was not explained by whitebark metrics, but we had this huge temporal variability in nutcracker visitation. In Mount Rainier, which is what you're seeing now, nutcracker density as a function of year is shown in gray, and nutcracker density as a function of crown kill is shown in orange. It's clear that nutcracker density declined dramatically in this park because crown kill trended with year in our model, it's not yet clear whether year or crown kill was the better predictor of nutcracker density. So in summary, in the north here, we found white pine blister rust had its largest effects on whitebark pine in Mount Rainier, where nutcracker densities have clearly declined. Nutcrackers that used to forage in Mount Rainier might have left this park for outside resources. At the same time, nutcracker densities have fluctuated more widely than whitebark in the North Cascades in a pattern that suggests these birds are tracking resources other than the park level population of whitebark pine. These birds can move long distances to forage on a variety of resources, perhaps leaving the remaining whitebark without an effective dispersal mechanism. So as these monitoring programs continue, we hope the flexible modeling framework we've demonstrated will be used with additional data to determine how nutcracker densities continue to respond in time and space to whitebark and alternative resources. There's going to be a lot more data from the South coming soon. And so now we're wondering, can the nutcracker just go on happily about his business despite pathogen-mediated declines in whitebark pine? I think the evidence from this study so far suggests that these birds really do move on when whitebark stops producing the resources that they need. They're either leaving a park completely, like it looks like they're leaving Mount Rainier during the breeding season, or they're only occasionally coming into a park like we're seeing in the North Cascades. Taza Shaming has shown that they're spending a lot of their time outside the park in the North Cascades region, foraging on other resources. And we guess that we might see something more like this in the future as we look at what happens in the South if blister rust comes into that system. I should also say, while we're on this slide, that since this time, when I did this study, I have modeled a longer term time series of nutcrackers in the Sierra Nevada network. And in both Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon, these birds are doing just fine there, and they're not fluctuating much at all. They've been quite stable. The population has been quite stable in that region. And so again, we have a little bit more information that temporally we are seeing stability in the nutcracker population in places where we have stability in the whitebark pine. And yet we have this tremendous instability in the north. Still, all of this is correlative, even though we put the trophic interaction into the model. it isn't necessarily a mechanistic model that we have made. And so we have to be careful about how we interpret these results. I just want to thank you at the end here for your interest in this project. And I'd like to acknowledge again my co-authors at the National Park Service and the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative, and welcome questions or comments through the Institute for Bird Populations. I'll say out loud that my email address is cray@birdpop.org. That's a lot like birdpoop.org, but it's birdpop. So thank you very much. I'd love to answer questions or just chat in general about these results with anybody. I guess I'm going to stop my sharing for just a moment, but I can share again if we want to go back to any images or anything that people notice along the way.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was fantastic. I just want to remind everyone that if you have a comment or a question, we're encouraging you to unmute yourself or raise your hand if you can't unmute yourself, so that we can get a verbal discussion going on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. This is Vlad, and I guess I could start. I have a question regarding the models that you chose to use and how they differed from park to park. I noticed that in the Pacific Northwest parks, your models didn't really have or didn't add the covariates together. You had separate models for kind of each environmental covariate, whereas in the Sierra and parks, it looked like additive models. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So unfortunately, a lot of the potential covariates we're interested in are highly correlated. So in the north, year was correlated with what was going on with anything in the whitebark, because disease in the whitebark increased by year. And because both of those variables were sort of focal variables, it decided to look at them using separate models and see whether there was a big difference in how good one model was compared to the other in terms of how, its fit and whether or not Nutcracker's response was predicted well by these different variables. In the south, elevation, of course, was correlated with whitebark occurrence and with foxtail occurrence, because these are higher elevation trees, but the correlation wasn't that strong. It wasn't so strong that we couldn't actually include all the variables in the same model. Other options, of course, are taking one of your covariates that's correlated with another one and regressing one covariate on another and using a residual as a covariate in the model of your ultimate response, which is the nutcrackers. And that is something that I actually did, but I've done this, it was over a year ago now, maybe 2 years, and can't remember exactly why I decided not to bother with reporting all of that. I did a lot of permutations of different kinds of modeling to finally get something that I felt was clear enough to present. I don't really like using residuals as covariates, because it gets harder and harder to explain what you're doing and what's going on and interpret what's going on in a model. So that's kind of a long answer to your question. Basically, it's that everything's confounded out there, and you got to figure out a way to look at how your response variable relates to these things without confounding what's happening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for answering my question. That's really closely related to what I'm doing right now. And then just as a quick follow-on question, what did you find was like the greatest impact to detection probability in your models?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. And let me try to remember what's going on there. So I actually explored effects of day of year and time of day and observer and the density of cover, because all those things can affect how well observers detect birds. The day of year and the time of day often affect how available a bird is for detection. And Taza will tell you these birds are hard to detect sometimes because they won't make themselves available. And even though they're a big showy bird and they're loud, sometimes they just stay quiet and hidden and you won't see them. So
Right.
I looked for those effects on the bird, all of those effects. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones are most important for nutcracker. I actually do this kind of analysis for hundreds of species. But I could bring it up in a sec here.
That's okay. I can also just look back in your paper as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at the paper too. So that's a little distracting to leave a big gap while I pull up the paper. But I was just remembering that in general, nutcrackers are not one of the species that we have any more trouble detecting than any other bird during the breeding season. And our surveys go into late July. An obvious question about this kind of research is, well, the breeding bird surveys that you're conducting, they happen earlier in the year than when nutcrackers are actually trying to harvest whitebark seeds usually. Although they do overlap in time with that period, it's not perfect. Well, that's absolutely right. The bird surveys are not designed to answer this particular question, whether or not nutcrackers and whitebark are having troubles. But it's still possible for us to use those data to look at trends at this time of year in these parks. And we do still see big differences over time in the parks where whitebark is declining. So that helps us, know that we probably need to spend a bit of our resources to try to figure out how to survey these animals at the right time of year and really good at this question.
Awesome. Thank you. Looks like we have some questions in the chat. Gregory DeNevers asks, how much do nutcrackers move downslope during the heavy snow time?
Oh, that's a great question, because I don't study this animal. I'm not the best person to answer it. And the data that I was working with was not from a heavy snow period at all. So we try to get in there to the high country after the snow has come off enough that the birds are nesting. So not these birds, but most birds. We'll have to refer back to Taza's papers on that, and of course, all the people who came before her. I'm sorry about that. I just don't know that answer.
Hi, I was just curious about something that maybe you don't have an answer to, but I was curious about, you mentioned foxtail pine was another pine that in the southern park regions is another food source. Has there been any research, or do you know of anybody researching whether or not that would be a viable food source with a similar sort of mutualism if whitebark pine succumbs to like white pine blister rust or other sort of pressures?
I think, Francis, I think that's a great question. And I do have some thoughts on that. So the first thing that's most closely related to your particular question is that the foxtail seed is a very different seed. It's not big and giant and as nutritious as the whitebark seed. So it's not clear that the nutcracker would ever necessarily have to develop, a mutualism with this pine. This pine is putting its resources into putting a wing on its seed so it can disperse its own seed, and so it's probably not going to fill the same role as a whitebark seed. Something more like a pinion nut, the Clark's nutcracker can just head off to another state and find other resources.
Right.
So that's more likely to fill a niche that's more similar to the whitebark pine. But, I do study the American pika. You can see my little icon here. And at my longest term study site in Montana, I've seen the decline of the whitebark, and I've seen nutcrackers at my study site every year since 1988. And what I've been struck by is they like to go sit still in the dead whitebark trees, but they'll go to the taluses where the pikas live, these broken rock habitats, and they'll harvest spiders. There are these spiders that run around on the talus. They're big and they carry their egg sacs on their butts and makes them look even bigger. And this is this big juicy resource for the nutcracker. And I haven't actually noticed them eating those spiders as much in the last 10 years, but in the first or in the 10 years before that, they were just chowing down on these spiders. So all of that just points to the ability of these birds to make use of all kinds of different resources, whether it's local to where they used to be, right near where the whitebark used to be. They might branch out and make use of some other random resources like spiders, or just take off across the landscape and find something altogether different. Anyway, it looks very much from our results like they're often taking off and not available anymore for us to count.
Are you going to be conducting any sort of like follow-up study with as things continue to sort of change in these high elevation forests, 2, 5, 15 years out?
Yeah, definitely. The long-term monitoring in the North Cascades, it's a little unsure right now whether or not those legacy plots that were monitored by Gina and her colleagues, I'm not sure what the plan is for continuing to monitor those. But the cool thing is, in the South, there's a long-term plan for monitoring whitebark plots, and we still have long-term monitoring of the nutcracker going on, and we can mate up these data sets using this modeling approach into the future. I also mentioned that we probably want to do some additional surveys of nutcrackers at different times of year. That would be something that we have to actually get funding for and plan for. But funding's already in place for this long-term monitoring that can help us answer the same question in the South that we've already answered in the North: what happens over time? So that's definitely planned. I forgot what I was going to say, but there was another thing that came up in your first question, and that is whitebark represent this great resource for the nutcrackers when it's there. But if they can just hang out locally and use other resources, like I mentioned, or other ones that Taza would be more familiar with, then whenever whitebark actually have seeds, these little remaining populations of whitebark that might have seeds, they could get overly hammered by nutcracker. In other words, the nutcracker population might be doing great, and they are a seed predator. And so a whole lot of the seeds that are produced by a small population could be harvested and effectively no longer available for germination. So we have to worry about the fact that as soon as the whitebark host gets to low levels, the dynamic that used to be important, where some of the seeds escape predation and germinated in the right place, that might not be so likely anymore if you have an extra large population of seed predators that's doing just fine, thank you very much, without their original host. So I just thought that would be something that I would want to make a mention of in this presentation.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like there's a lot of effort for like planting restoration efforts in some of the areas where that dynamic has really drastically started to change. So
yeah, and kind of leading into this next question from Dr. Diana Tomback, Has anyone been monitoring Clark's nutcrackers and ponderosa pine to see if numbers may be changing over time in that ecosystem?
Oh, great. We are at the Institute of Bird Populations. We're monitoring birds, and again in the breeding season. So maybe through the end of July, and we're monitoring wherever they occur. So we're not really focused on particular tree assemblages or anything like that. So it really depends on there being tree plots that we can mate up with these bird data. The plots in the Sierra Nevada the tree plots that we used, of course, they're keeping data on all of the tree species in the plots, but they're not necessarily a bunch of ponderosa pine because they were focused more on white pine resources. So I'm not really sure. I think maybe somebody here on this call can address that a little bit more, how many ponderosa might pop up in those plots, right? But it's super important for answering this particular question that more of the ecology go into where we're monitoring. What we've done here is just try to make use of long-term data sets that exist and that are appropriate for modeling. So it's the proverbial, we're looking under the lamppost for our keys because that's where the light is. And I very much would acknowledge that these data sets are not necessarily ideal for answering this question. And I hope I sort of mentioned that somewhere along the way, maybe not, but anyway, I'm doing it now. And that we really want to just use this as something that helps guide us to what we really need in the future, which is actually co-located plots at the right time of year. And for nutcrackers, that's really challenging because nutcrackers can go all over the place, like Diana mentioned, and making use of all kinds of resources. So the best thing would be just monitoring these birds where they are to understand more of what they're using.
Thanks. Gina Fryer says, I work with industry in Canada. Often entire mountains may be compromised, roughly 250 hectares. These populations were connected within mountain chains. And I'm assuming she's talking about whitebark pine. A mitigation question that is frequently asked is, should we be worried about the Clark's nutcracker with this level of habitat loss?
Super important thought. It's important to keep in mind the vigility of this bird. It seems to me like they might be able to relocate to better places, but any loss of habitat at this point, given how much habitat has already been lost, is always of concern. Because if your habitat becomes too lacy at some point, it doesn't support a population the size that it used to support, and then you're on a downward spiral. So it's really important to consider this issue that she brought up. The scale of the loss sounds big, and even for birds like this might be important, but I can't really address that any further.
Thanks, Chris. And I guess I just had a comment related to what you were talking about before with doing a more targeted nutcracker count. As far as like counting them in their breeding season, which seems to be able to go from anywhere in January through May, it seems like it would be really hard to get up into those areas within the Sierra and Cascades parks because they're just so covered in snow. And then, so how would you, if you could just like talk about how you would envision setting up the logistics to count nutcrackers during specifically their breeding season, as opposed to just breeding bird season
Yeah, and that's a great point. And also it's not just during their breeding season, but we need to understand where they are making use of all these different resources around the year, because of course they cache their resources to some extent in ways that are really important for feeding their offspring at a different time of year. So it really complicated system. But we have some really new, nice tools coming into play here. And one of them that might be useful in this particular situation is the acoustic recording unit. So putting those out, hopefully we could capture bird use of different areas and get a feel for their annual cycle without having to actually have boots on the ground and see them. Especially during wintertime, it could possibly be useful. That said, I do use acoustic recording units to some extent here in Colorado just to study pikas. And yeah, I tell you, boy, at 12,000 feet in the middle of winter, it's really hard to keep anything going in terms of an acoustic recording unit. But that will all improve with time, and perhaps we'll be able to start calibrating at least our estimates based on acoustic recording use with the counts that we already make, because we're putting them out in places where we're also doing human counts, at least during breeding season activities. And so this is just a new area that hopefully will be able to help us infer more about what's going on year round with these animals. Having boots on the ground though would be really cool, or skis or snowshoes, whatever it takes. So if we ever can get to a place where we have the human resources to do these things, how cool. But so far that's been limited to a very select group of researchers who have made it their life's work to get out there as much as they can year round to understand what's going on. And that doesn't lend itself so much to large data sets that we can really throw at these very complicated questions where we have a lot of parameters to estimate, and we need a lot of data to do those estimates.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you ever need anyone to go ski out into the Sierra to look for nutcrackers, I would do it.
Nice.
Yeah, we have a comment from John Bosch. He says, to respond to Diana's question, none of the current legacy plots in North Coast and Cascades Network have Pinus ponderosa, which barely gets into our Pacific Northwest parks. To respond to the other question about continuing monitoring, we have a new set of monitoring plots selected for park-wide inference that we hope to continue to monitor. Legacy plots are discontinued for several reasons, including safety of access and high mortality, leaving only a few trees in many plots.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's great information. And I'm sorry that I actually forgot about the fact that there's long-term monitoring planned at grid selected plots up in the north as well as in the south. I only emphasized the south because I was already using data from those plots, and I did not use data from the planned long-term plots in the north because there weren't enough data available yet when I did this research. So thanks so much for reminding us about that and for telling us that ponderosa doesn't come into those legacy plots, those long-term plots in the north. Can you speak maybe to whether ponderosa comes into the long-term monitoring plots in the south?
It looks like John doesn't have a microphone. From my memory working on the high elevation white pine monitoring crew for Johnny Nesmith, we didn't have many, if any, ponderosa in our plots.
Okay, cool. Good to know.
I don't mean to ask a question that maybe I missed or maybe is probably obvious to everybody else, but what is the significance of having ponderosa in some of these plots versus not?
Well, maybe Diane's available to answer, but until she gets on, it is certainly a resource that the Nutcracker use. And
Okay.
So she's particularly interested in whether or not we're seeing evidence that they're using that resource. But unfortunately, we don't really have any good ponderosa data yet to explore that question.
Gotcha.
Yeah, here she is.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk. I'm really enjoying it, and I've been following your work for some time now. Ponderosa pine is a relatively large-seeded winged conifer, and we see in a number of studies, including Teresa Lorenz and our work in Rocky Mountain National Park here in Colorado, that nutcrackers often move from either limber pine, or I guess in Montana it would be whitebark, into ponderosa when a cone crop is produced. It's an alternative seed source, but avidly used. And just thinking whether if whitebark is declining in the North Cascades, in particular in the Cascades, whether we would see heavier use of alternative seed sources like ponderosa pine, Douglas fir. And in the Sierra, that would also include single leaf pinyon, limber pine, Jeffrey pine, ponderosa. In other words, is there enough seed resource to maintain a population level? So it's just a question we should all be aware of and think about in terms of the future. If whitebark is restored, do we have a reservoir of nutcrackers, because they do disperse other seeds, that could return to the whitebark pine? So that's my thinking, Chris, on that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Great, Diana. Another thing is your question about whether or not they're doing this in these North Cascades and Mount Rainier parks. I think you guys have Taza Shaming on the schedule to talk. Maybe she's already talked about the use of other alternative resources in that area, especially around North Cascades. I don't know if anybody on this call remembers what she said, if she's already talked, but maybe it's just something to be looking forward to hear more about their use of alternative resources.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Taza gave the first talk of this series, and that is available on the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation's YouTube page. And I can post that link in the chat as well to revisit that information. We also got a question from Michael McWilliams. He asks, are there any plots at Crater Lake? There's a lot of whitebark, but also ponderosa. That might be a place to set up some plots.
Yeah, that sounds great. No, I don't know of anything right now, but yeah, you know, it seems like for a bird like this that can really move, I wonder whether we need something more coordinated across a much larger landscape, including interesting geologic features like Crater Lake that have slightly different mix of habitat for the bird, or at least a different mix in terms of scale of change in the landscape, but combined with a much larger sampling frame that would integrate ideally north to south, east to west, looking across the Rockies and the Sierra and Cascade ranges to see what's going on more broadly with a bird that can move like this. Yeah, I'd really like to see a much more coordinated sampling going forward, but that's going to take a new project.
Thanks. Yeah, and Devin Stuckey commented that Klamath Inventory and Monitoring Network is monitoring whitebark in Crater Lake and also some sugar pine, but they do not know about the status of ponderosa.
Cool. Well, birds are one thing that gets monitored all over the place, but not always on the time scale that we'd like, as we've already mentioned. So for this particular mutualism, it's probably important to consider what would be the ideal monitoring strategy. And I think that could take a whole workshop trying to figure out exactly what to do that would work at all scales and locations across the range of the system.
Yeah, and considering how eruptive these birds are too, would be really difficult. I think satellite transmitters are a really interesting avenue to explore the movements of these birds.
Diana has her hand up.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you for mentioning satellite transmitters. So there's obviously a group of us, including TASA, others that are putting GPS tags on nutcrackers, and we're working now in Yellowstone National Park doing the same thing. And I think this will help Chris answer some of these questions, such as where do they go? And do they come back? And over how wide an area do they range in order to collect enough seeds to cache to get them through the winter and to feed their nestlings? So I see this along with monitoring are two prongs, but they both will address questions in slightly different ways. So hopefully they will start bringing answers here so we'll understand the system a little better. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's really exciting, the work that's being done by Diana and Taza with the transmitters. And I just see with the development of the modeling frameworks that are available, that integration of data from different sources through integrated population modeling can really shed some light on these questions into the future. Even when you have small data sets, obviously the sort of transmitters type data is very hard to come by and takes a lot of time to generate, not necessarily very many data points, but those data points are, as Diana said, very valuable, and they can be integrated into models that also use data from other sources to estimate a lot of parameters and figure out what's going on across a larger range.
yeah, and Chris, have you done any of the data set integration in a Bayesian framework, like different types of counts?
I am only really starting in that. I plan to be doing more, but right now I haven't done a lot. My colleague Jim Sharako at Institute for Bird Populations is much more steeped in integrated population modeling than me. But I do have a project that I'm going forward with on that. Doesn't have to do with Clark's Nutcracker, but yeah, pretty soon I'll have my feet wet in that, and I just, I read papers and I just see so much development in that area, and a lot of promise to tie all these bits together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be curious to see what you find. Alrighty. If anyone has any more questions or comments, please raise your hand or throw them in the chat. Okay, great. Looks like everyone's asked their questions. I want to once again thank Chris for an excellent talk, and thanks to our audience for your attendance and engagement with this science. We hope you'll be joining us again next month on May 17th. We're going to have a talk by David Tama, who will be presenting on whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Hope to see you all there, and thanks again.
Thank you.